Hi, we continue with the Garden of Eden story today and chapter 3, and we're going to go through the first 5 verses with the talking snake and the woman. And one of our challenges in understanding the meaning of this story is to defamiliarize ourselves with it. It seems so familiar, the Garden of Eden story from childhood or other places, that we forget what a really strange story this is. Talking snake, and where is God in this story, and what's going on? So if we could try to put aside whatever presuppositions we might have, and I'm going to go over a couple of those in just a minute, perhaps we can hear how this scene in the beginning of chapter 3 fits with what we saw before and sets really the terms of the entire book of Genesis. So if you recall the structure, one of the structures we've been looking at as a way of mapping the story, we're in the sea scene here, this dialogue between the snake and the woman, and it's paralleled on the other side between the dialogue between God, the man, and the woman, and the center is verse 6 to 8, which we'll go to next time. Also important that as we begin the story, while I'm on this screen, is the wordplay that sets it up. And I got to go back one verse so you can see this here. So at the end of chapter 2, and the man and his woman, not wife, there's no word for wife in Hebrew, were both naked and were not ashamed. Now the serpent was more crafty. Now, as we said before, the chapter markers are not part of the original text and were not inserted until the medieval era to help copyists keep track of where they were. So really, this just continues here. And the man and his woman were both naked and were not ashamed, and the serpent was more crafty. But there's more. As you can see here, the word for naked, arum, is matched here by the description of the serpent. The only thing we know about the serpent, that it's arum, crafty or sly. And the word for that here is otherwise used often positively. Like in Proverbs, it's contrasted with a fool. So we see, for example, it's translated as prudent here. Fools show their anger at once, but the prudent ignore an insult. In other places, we can see the translation as fitting ours more precisely. Here it's clever. The clever do all things intelligently, but the fool displays folly. So from the perspective of Proverbs, the serpent is being described as something positive, although crafty in English may suggest something dishonest or underhanded. But we don't know that. But before we get there, we have to go back a couple of words just to see more details of what's happening. Because New Revised Standard creates a transition that's not there with the use of the word now, separating this scene from the one before it. But in the Hebrew, which you can see over here, and even if you can't read it, you can understand this point, is that the word for serpent here, Nahash, is preceded by two initial things, the va, which means and ha, which means the. So literally it's, and the serpent was more crafty. So in other words, if we're reading continuously without the chapter markers, the man and his woman were both arum and were not ashamed. Now the serpent was more arum, and the serpent was more arum. So there's much more continuity than we'd otherwise get. And so many things are raised here that are surprises if we let them be surprises. So if you're starting off going, oh, I know what the serpent is, it's the devil, it's Satan. Well, no. That association could not possibly have been made in any time period in which Genesis was written, especially in the period we're looking at in the Babylonian exilic period, because of many complex factors, but the least of which is the concept of Satan only entered into the biblical world with the Persian conquest of the Babylonians and 200 years of Zoroastrianism and Persian political control. The Satan in Persian was a political spy that the Persians sent out to watch to see what was happening in the provinces or the colonies and would report back and accuse people of disloyalty. So then Satan became this mythological expression of somebody who accuses you to the king, namely God. The devil is a whole other issue, and I won't get into that now. But the association of the snake and the devil and Satan only comes from passages like this in Revelation 12. So we see this here where the great portent is in heaven, and we see the story of the pregnant woman giving birth to a son and the dragon, and we see farther down here the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Now, we're assuming that by the ancient serpent it's referring to Genesis, although it doesn't say that, but there's no other ancient serpent that in the biblical text that could fit that image. But again, Revelation is obviously much later than Genesis. So as readers, we don't know anything about that association. So we have to start from scratch and ask, what about this serpent? Before we do, I'd like to start with a quote from Mark Brett, who tells us something about the trajectory of what's going on here with the serpent and the people. And I really like this quote that I'll read us here from the bottom of my screen. So he says, if the first creation story, which is, of course, Genesis 1, deconstructs a royal image of Elohim by democratizing democratizing it, which is to say that all human beings are in the image and likeness of God. The second creation story undermines any royal aspirations humankind as a whole may have had by satirizing the human failure to rule over even the creatures which creep upon the earth. So recall that chapter 1 included that the humans would have rule over the creatures, but obviously this snake is out of control of the humans. So Brett continues, the only kind of rule spoken about in Genesis 3 is the lamentable patriarchal rule of male over female, which of course we'll get to in a couple of sessions, a symptom of alienation befitting this newfound royal knowledge. It is a symptom of alienation that characterizes life outside the Garden of Eden, and in this sense, male rule is a sign of distance from God, not likeness to God. And we'll see that play out more in chapter 4 with Cain, the builder of the first city, as he is alienated from God. So that's just a little bit of the trajectory before we move past this first verse. So we have to go back to the situation. The story presents us with this serpent who has a characteristic we normally don't associate with non-human animals, without any hesitation to say that to us. And again, if we're reading Genesis 2 and 3 as continuous with Genesis 1, then this is not evil because all the creatures were made good. So this is a good creature of God's who's more arome than any of the other wild animals the Lord God had made, suggesting the others might be crafty, but this one is just more crafty. So there's something to be considered there. And then it said to the woman, and most readers now have no reaction to, wait, a talking snake? And the woman doesn't have any surprise. Of course, why would she know that snakes can't talk? Curiously, what we're going to find out later is that this snake serpent has legs, and which will be removed. And it'll be odd to us that the punishment will be to walk on its belly rather than to be quiet and not speak English to humans or Hebrew to humans, which would be what we might think the punishment would be. But that's not what will unfold, as we'll see. So the talking serpent is a given here, and not only is the serpent talking, but it's apparently been present or knows God from some other way, or is a liar, and we as readers have to decide that. And we have to ask, why to the woman? Where's the man? Now we have a woman and a man. The woman is not named yet, so she simply describes the ish here, the woman. Why is he speaking to the woman? Where is the man? And we'll find out that the man's not in this scene at all. Is he sleeping? That's what rabbis often thought, that the man and woman had sex and the man was sleeping after sex and missed the whole thing. But of course that's not in the text itself. But the fact that the serpent is speaking to the woman is really saying something important about this woman's agency. Again, against the much later Christian sense of this woman being a temptress and all women being temptresses. This story knows nothing about any of that later wild sexist misreading. So, and the question the serpent asks is a very odd question and very convoluted in the Hebrew as well as in the English. So let's just follow the English to here. So it asks a question. Did God say? And note that already the serpent is, or the authors of Genesis in this case, are making the question, how good is your memory? How good is your ability to quote? It could have been many other things that, if we're going to present the beginning of human disobedience or moving away from God, there could have been countless ways that could have been introduced. But why be introduced with the question of remembering? And it might be because the Word of God needs to be remembered precisely. And when we get to the later scenes in this chapter, we'll see exactly how this text plays upon the inaccurate memory and the disastrous consequences that flow from that. So, ask this question, did God say? And then the question is phrased this way, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden. Now, I don't know about you, but I listened to that question and I went, what? Wait, what exactly are you saying? Does it mean you can't eat from any tree? That you shouldn't eat from any of the trees, or that out of all the trees there may be exceptions to which trees you can't eat out of? In any event, of course, this isn't what God said. We'd have to look, and let's look back to 2:16 to see what the exact quote is here. And the Lord God commanded the Adam, at this case, before the woman is made, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden. So, and freely here is, we might remember, is that double verb, you may eat, yes, eat. So freely has been added for the translation's sake. But you may eat, stated positively, of every tree in the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it starts off with the positive and then creates an exception. But in the snake's retelling, it starts with the negative and incorporates the general into it and makes it very confusing. Because is there a yes or no answer to this question that makes sense? Did God say that? Well, God didn't say this, so the answer is no. But notice the woman doesn't respond. Let's look at a couple more details here as we go. So, as Westerman notes, the serpent refers to God simply as Elohim, and notes the name Yahweh belongs only to the context of the relation of humans there. It also suggests that Yahweh is not the God of the serpent, but Elohim, the Canaanite lead deity, which we'll see later on, how Elohim and other names of God would have fit what the locals, the non-Israelites, might have thought in the land before they were in exile. So Westerman takes this as a distinction in the Yahwist author here between the Yahweh God who's speaking to the man and the woman and simply Elohim, who the serpent is quoting. So then, notice it's a plural here. The serpent's quote is from God is plural, even though he's only speaking to her, and she responds in the plural with we here. Notice this comparison of what she says here. She omits the mikal, every, included by God there and twice by the narrator in 3:1. The any tree, any here. So she says, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But do you notice what difference she makes there? Did God distinguish the fruit of the trees from the trees themselves? Again, let's go back and look. You may freely eat, eat of every tree. It doesn't say of the fruit. She added that. She's assuming that the part of the tree is edible. Based on what? As far as we know, this is her first meal. They haven't eaten anything yet, as far as we can tell. So she separates the tree itself from the fruit, and that already is going to be a challenge, as we see. But she adds, she knows there's a distinction here. But where does she know it from? We can take this two ways. We can either take that the Adam was an Eve woman, as we saw, Hava, a Nefesh Hava, so a living being, but also with Hava, Eve, the name that he gives her later in there, and so she was there. Or we can look at it from the rabbinical sense of they were two-sided, and she was just there, even though there was no separation until, so the Adam was already implicitly an Ish and Isha. Or he told her. We don't know the answer to how she knows, but she seems to know, even if her knowledge isn't exactly right. So she adds here, and but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die. And I'd like to pause this for a moment, but I won't. You could pause it to say, what has she added? What has she changed here? And why does it matter? So one thing that should be obvious is the tree is not named. So the way she hears it, it's an arbitrary command. You can eat all the trees except that one. Is it about position? Is it because in the middle of the garden? Or is it just arbitrary? 100 trees and you can eat 99 of them, but not that one. So in her hearing, there's no reason for it. Even though in 2:16 a reason wasn't given why humans can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, still it's the knowledge of good and evil, and whatever that means is we'll explore a little more as we go, and we explored it a little more last time, but we'll see some more of that coming up. That already gives us a frame of reference, whereas simply the tree in the middle tells us nothing and makes it sound like God is giving just an arbitrary punishment. Like the way many of my undergrad students think that God is just making random rules, or people talk about the government like they're just making rules to make rules rather than have reasons, at least in the minds of the rule makers, of why that rule was important. But she hears it just simply as a rule. And not only that, she adds this crucial phrase, which is going to be tragic. Nor shall you touch it. Now clearly, the phrase here, which is this term, touch, is in each of the wife-sister stories and will come out there. But the point of the note here is it has a certain sexual connotation, a certain implicit eroticism, to use a Greek word, Greek philosophical word, eros, as a form of love, that's physical. So touching later is about fertility, and here touching is about food. And of course, food and fertility or eating and bodies are all very close together, and we'll see more of that as we go. But for the moment, the fact that she adds this additional prohibition is going to destroy everything. Because as we know, there are many things that you can't eat, but you can touch. You won't die if you touch a poisonous fruit of some kind, and especially if the poison is in the seed or not on the surface of it. All kinds of things where a more intense prohibition simply leads those who are prohibited to wonder, really, if this line isn't the danger line, maybe the other line isn't the danger line either. In other words, if you touch it, nothing happens. Maybe I can eat it and nothing will happen either. But this is not God's fault. This is her lack of precise memory, or perhaps the Adam's lack of precise narration. We don't know which. We'll see this pattern a number of times in Genesis, and we'll be able to compare directly human speech or divine speech with how it's repeated by others. And then she concludes her recollection of it with, or you shall die, and it doesn't include the on the day you eat of it, which is what it said in 2:16, which of course will not be what happens, as we see. So her incorrect memory leads to this point, and now the serpent will respond. And as my note here says, each of the serpent's three statements are true and not true at different levels. So let's look at the three statements, and then we can go back and look at that, and then we'll be done for today. So the serpent said three things to the woman. You will not die. Second, God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened. And finally, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And so as my note here says, the question of death is both true and not true. They will not physically die right away, and that's true, but they will be kicked out of the garden, and that's perhaps a form of death to the easy life that they were created to live. The question of their eyes open, well, their eyes are obviously literally open. They can see, and she will see the fruit. In fact, we see in the very next verse that we'll look at next time, she saw the tree was good for food. So plainly their eyes are literally opened, but there's some other kind of opening your eyes that the serpent is talking about. And then you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And as my note has here, not regarding moral discernment, but yes, read the shame of nakedness. So good and evil will lead them to the shame of nakedness, but not lead them to what the knowledge of good and evil might imply, which is all moral knowledge and therefore the ability to make a good moral choice. And I note a couple other small details here. You will be like God. The like God, and I want to show you the Hebrew here so you can see the specifics here. Really, it comes down to one letter. So Elohim, this much is the name for God, and it's really just the K at the beginning here. You see the K that is a preposition that can make it a simile. And so we see that here in Psalm 77. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is so great as our God? So a comparison with other gods and their God, in this case Elohim. Also in Zechariah, we see, on that day Yahweh will shield the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so the feeblest among them on that day shall be like David, and the house of David shall be like God, like the angel of the Lord. So three comparisons there. All based on this little ka preface on Elohim. So the difference between God and like God, and what that likeness is, of course, echoes and contrasts to what we saw in the first garden story in Genesis 1:26 and 27. There it's a very different kind of word. Here it's demuth, likeness, and we also saw how image was tselem here. So tselem and demuth express a combined view of humans' relationship with God. But here it's different. It's not human likeness of God. It's somehow you'll be like God in the moral knowledge. And this is where the snake is simply wrong. And we will end it there, except for a couple of questions I'd like to leave with you as readers as we continue. Why is God allowing this to happen? Why is God allowing this snake to mislead and deceive these humans? Does God know what the outcome will be? Does God want this outcome? Is the serpent an agent of God? We know the serpent's going to be cursed, but the fact that God allows this serpent here and allows the woman and the man to eat the food and only later interrupts is something we ought to be paying attention to. Also, if the snake isn't the devil, what might the snake represent? In various ancient cultures, and we can look at this more when we see the curse of the snake in a couple of sessions, the snake could represent wisdom or fertility or healing or all kinds of things. There aren't a lot of snakes in the Bible, but one is the bronze serpent that Moses sets up as a healing against poisonous snakes in the wilderness. And the other thing to pay attention to is that the word for serpent here, nahash, also means, is like close to the verb for practicing divination. Coming from a root meaning both shiny and enchanting. So there's something here about the nature of the serpent as embodying the ability to know God's will, but a prohibited knowledge, because divination, as we know, as we'll see in the Samuel series, is something that Israel prohibited to its people, as if it was trying to get secret knowledge of God's will that was not available to others. So the question of whether the serpent, not being the devil, might represent some kind of wisdom that either God wants to the people to have, or at least will allow the people to have, even though there'll be difficult consequences, will be something we'll have to explore. And we'll pick some of that theme up when we continue as we move into the next scene in verse 6 next time. See you then. Bye-bye.